Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet.
So China is the flavor of the season, and this is a very long season. For us in India, it began in one way with April last year, when trouble started in Ladakh. For the world and also for India, in another manner, the season started as early as December of 2019, when the first cases of the virus came out. Although until that time, nobody imagined it will become such a global pandemic, because people also thought somehow that SARS-1 had also got contained in some areas. And third, we had the big anniversary of Tiananmen, which passed, and there's too little on China in India. We talk about China all the time, but I think we see more of China in Faltu movies and in some of our primetime TV maramaris than we understand of China. So India is very fortunate that India has had some of its most stellar diplomats who've served in China and who know the language. And I will tell you a story. In 1989, when Tiananmen massacre took place, Indian press did not send out many people overseas for stories, but India Today, where I worked, he sent us out. So with photographer Prashant Panjyar, I was there, and there was a bunch of young Indian diplomats, young Indian political team under Shiv Shankar Menon. And that team included Vijay Gokhale, who rose to be the Foreign Secretary of India, ambassador to China, and a very fine scholar and teacher. And what he's done is, besides his substantive books on China, policy, understanding China, and we'll talk about a lot of that now, he's also produced this wonderful and short book. So it's a very easy and very exciting read on the Tiananmen Square massacre, what happened there, because he was there. Even people like us, we take credit that we got there while there were still blotches of blood or blood stains on the streets, but we didn't quite witness what was happening. So Vijay was among those. Vijay, Shiv Shankar Menon, there was Gautam Bambawale, am I correct?
Yes.
Who was also retired now and is teaching in Pune, and there was a Debashish Chakrabarti.
Yes.
Who I haven't been in touch with. So thank you very much, and thank you. This is a very important fill in the blanks in our history and understanding of China. So tell us, first of all, what happened in 1989? Tell us a young watcher's story. You were still learning to be a China specialist.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you for inviting me on your program. And thank you for introducing my book. This book is a labor of love because I was still in my 20s when the Tiananmen incident happened. And for me, this was probably the most important event that I witnessed in the 1980s. And so it stayed on in my memory. It stayed on also because I kept asking myself whether to believe the Western narrative that this was an upsurge of democracy in the Chinese people, or to accept the Chinese narrative, which was that this was in fact a small handful of people who were determined to topple the communist system, or whether it was something which was different from both these versions. And in the course of the past 30 years, as a result of reading and talking to people and returning back to Beijing, my conclusion was that while at one level there was a strong movement among the students because there was dissatisfaction as a result of poor economic performance and so on, at another level it was a struggle within the Communist Party. It was basically a factional struggle. And the factions tried to use the students and eventually spun out of control. And I wrote the book because I think that although this is a historical event, although it is recent history, but you cannot understand China today without understanding what happened in 1989, because Shekhar, as we know, the same party rules China even today. It is stronger, it is more powerful, it has greater capacities economically, militarily, and diplomatically. And I felt that as a close neighbor, Indians cannot afford to ignore China any longer. And by that, I mean the ordinary Indian public. And therefore, I wrote the book, hopefully in a style which I felt might be easier to read, particularly among the younger generation.
So you were in your 20s then. So you were even younger than us. We thought we were very young then. Just take us back. Take us back to the scene. Where were you? Were you asleep, awake, in office when the big crackdown took place? And when did you first get out and what did you see?
Well, it of course began on the 15th of April when the former General Secretary Hu Yaobang, who at one stage had been Deng Xiaoping's nominee for his successor, but whom he subsequently abandoned because of differences on political reform, died suddenly of a heart attack. Now, the upsurge of empathy and sympathy that arose in the universities was an interesting phenomenon, and that's where it really began. It began in the universities. And as it happened, purely by coincidence, a couple of our diplomats were in the Beijing University on that day. They had gone for some other business. And they happened to see the small character posters. These are A4 sized posters written with ink and brush, which were going up on the walls of Beijing University. And because they could read these posters, they came back and reported to the ambassador that something was afoot in the universities. So it started essentially as a sympathetic movement, as a mourning for Hu Yaobang. But the way it was subsequently handled by the Communist Party, it quickly spiraled into a movement for change. And subsequently, that movement for change broadened from simply being a student movement to involving all segments of society. And then, of course, there was the declaration of martial law on the 20th of May, which was, in a sense, a phony martial law because there was no immediate use of force or even immediate substantial deployment of force. But then the final denouement was on the 3rd of June when the full force of the People's Liberation Army was brought to bear in terms of tanks, in terms of armored personnel carriers, and in terms of troops heavily armed, and the clearing of the square and the subsequent crackdown that occurred, as a result of which you have never ever after that had any public protest in Beijing again. And it has now been 32 years since that incident.
Were you able to watch any of that? I bet you heard the sound of tanks. I mean, they didn't fire, but the fact is that tanks going on streets makes noise.
So we were able to watch a lot of the events, Shekhar, because the apartment we had was on the main avenue of eternal peace leading to Tiananmen Square. So for the entire 50 days, we watched the processions go, we watched the barricades come up, we watched the PLA trucks moving in when martial law was declared, and the manner in which the citizenry tried to reason with them, offer them food, sometimes even push them around. And then, of course, on the 3rd of June, in the very early morning of the 4th of June, we saw the tanks and the armored personnel carriers move in. And we saw a couple of incidents of violence as well. Surprisingly, not against the public, but against the public security forces. In front of our residence, ours was on the 6th floor, we actually saw an armored personnel carrier attacked by Molotov cocktails by the bystanders, by the citizens. And then they pulled the soldiers out of the armored personnel carrier. And while we did not see them being actually beaten, the mood of the crowd was such that I doubt they were put into a car and sent home. I suspect that some amount of violence against them must have taken place. So we were able to witness quite a few things which gave us a real sense of what was happening. Besides that, of course, a number of us used to visit the square regularly. both in the day and in the evenings, and talk to people. So we had a reasonable idea of what was happening throughout this period.
The Chinese never put any restrictions on foreign diplomats going out, meeting people there.
I think the system had broken down, Shekhar. There was a sort of paralysis within the system because the leadership was divided on what to do. And therefore, because this is a highly centralized state, these security forces had no instructions. And what really complicated matters, and I point this out in the book, was the visit of the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, in mid-May. This was a very major foreign policy event for China, something akin to Richard Nixon's visit in 1972. And it was going to be the cherry on top of the cake for Deng Xiaoping's diplomatic strategy. Nobody wanted to take the risk in government of taking action which might adversely affect this. And therefore, I think a paralysis set in. But this paralysis, of course, allowed the other side, which was the students and the movement itself, to gather steam. And this is why the situation spiraled out of control.
So you made a very important statement in the beginning. You said that you cannot understand China of today unless you understand 1989 and Tiananmen. Explain that, please.
Yeah, so my contention, which I bring out in the last chapter of the book, Shekhar, is that here is a party which is dedicated to self-perpetuation, which has, in the course of the past 30 or 40 years, brought about economic reform and a better standard of life, but in the process has abandoned communism as an ideology to be practiced. Of course, they preach it, but they don't practice it anymore. What is in fact substituted it is a sense of nationalism, national pride, and sometimes that becomes ultra-national sentiment, which in a sense is dangerous. Now, the same aristocracy which ruled China in 1989 continues to rule there today. These are children of the first and second generation leaders. Their entire objective is to preserve and perpetuate their power. And therefore, it is extremely important for other countries, particularly countries like India, which are neighbors to China, to understand what is happening in China today. And for that purpose, you need to see what happened in 1989. Even the Chinese say that 1989 was such an important turning point for them that it continues to influence them today. Just last month, the Communist Party brought out a short history of its past 100 years. And in that, there is one particular statement which says that it is the incident of 1989 which compelled the party to look in a cool-headed manner at its present and its future. So I think that gives us a clue that the party continues to draw major lessons from the 1989 incident in its effort to perpetuate its rule for the next 100 years, beginning from this year.
Next 100 years, beginning from this year. Now, this is Xi Jinping's party, and we know that Xi Jinping's Communist Party is very strong. So you fill in the blanks. I will read out a sentence. Under Xi Jinping now, the Communist Party of China is the strongest ever since.
Well, I don't want to fill in that sentence, Shekhar, because one of the points I do want our readers to take away from the book is that although we imagine the Communist Party to be a monolith, in fact, within the party, there is a lot of factionalism and a lot of differences of opinion. Now, the benefit we get from the Tiananmen incident is that for a very short while, for a window of maybe 60 days, we got a good look at how that operates. So although there were strong men, and there are strong men and strong leaders in China, whether that is Mao or Deng or presently Xi Jinping, we should not assume that there is absolute unity and that the entire party and country are marching to the tune of one person. We must presume that there are differences of opinion, and we need to be alert on the lookout as to when that might spill over into a movement or bring about some amount of political change, while of course being practical enough to recognize, and I do believe the government of India is practical enough to recognize that we have to do business with the China that is the China of today.
So do you think Xi Jinping's Communist Party also, there are differences of opinion, and internally people are either questioning him or fretting or sharpening their knives?
I don't doubt it, Shekhar, because a few recent developments, particularly during the post-COVID period, indicate this. What has begun is a purge within the public security organs of the state. That is the People's Armed Police, the PLA, and the Public Security Bureau. Now, you don't normally purge internal security organs unless you are concerned that there might be elements of resistance within the security forces. And one particular statement made by the security czar of China, a gentleman by the name of Chen Yixin, is that we must scrape the poison from the bones. Now, that's an indicative statement because it means the poison has seeped below the skin, the tissue, and the muscle to the bone. And therefore, this rectification campaign suggests that there may be a problem. The other interesting statement is attributed to Xi Jinping himself. Now, Xi Jinping, in a speech he gave in February, if I'm not mistaken, he said that the most likely breach in the fortress will come from inside the fortress. He said in Chinese, and I quote this, "Paole she romi cong nei pu ung po." Now, that's an interesting statement because while publicly the Communist Party says that America and the West want to effect regime change, here is the top leader saying the real danger is not from outside the fortress, but within the fortress.
That is the exact translation of what he said in his language.
Yes, he says that the main problem is it will come from within the fortress. Now, this is interesting because this also suggests that there is an underlying concern that the whole purpose of the party has got diluted over the past 70 years as this prosperity and wealth and power allow the cadres to enjoy themselves. So another interesting theme that is now repeatedly being said by the top leadership is the need to inherit the red gene. The red gene, in other words, the DNA of the next generation of the cadres needs to be infused with the red gene so that they continue the communist tradition. Now, you say this only if there's a weakening of the redness within the cadre. If the cadre is red, then you have nothing to worry about. As it starts getting more and more pica, as they say, you begin to get concerned. And his repeated references to red, whether it is in terms of the PLA's loyalty, whether it's in terms of his statements on culture, whether it is in terms of his statements on the party cadres, suggests an underlying concern that the next generation don't seem to be as committed to the Communist Party's survival as his generation. So these are little clues to the fact that while he may be a very dominant figure in China, there is always room and cause for worry.
Yeah, worry for him, not for the rest of the world. Now, it's one thing that he's saying we need to sort of re-inject the red gene. That's fine. It was also very touching that he sent out this very sort of spirited message on Marx's anniversary.
Yes.
I thought Marx would turn in his grave to watch what is being done in his name. But how does a party continue like this forever? What have the Chinese done, CCP done, that the Russians, that the Soviets did not do? So Soviets broke up with the end of the Cold War. We know that one reason is that before the Cold War ended, 20 years before that, Red China became an ally of the West. But what else did the party do to keep this control?
Well, I think the party's greatest achievement is its economic policy. Year on year from 1985, with the exception of a couple of years, China has delivered a real growth above 7 to 8%, with a real growth in incomes and real prosperity and an improved quality of life. And there is no doubt about that, Shekhar, particularly for people who served in China in the 80s and went back in this decade. The difference is so stark as to be almost awe-inspiring. Now, my guess is that for a population which seems to have got its material wants satisfied year after year, the likelihood of them rising up against this party simply because they don't have a few freedoms like freedom of expression or freedom of assembly might be muted. And I suspect that Xi Jinping understands that if he can continue down this path, he might be able to stave off any problem for the foreseeable future. For a very brief while, there was a concern in February and March last year when COVID appeared to overwhelm Wuhan and parts of China, and where the state floundered in an attempt to respond. And you could see the Chinese state almost tightening its grip on power. But of course, subsequently, I think they've been able to handle the pandemic and the economy has been restored back to its growth trajectory. So I think that at this point, I don't see any imminent crisis.
So the trouble that they started in April, certainly. There's no doubt about that. The trouble they started in April, do you think that could also have something to do with their nervousness post-Wuhan, that let's start something else because we need to build nationalism?
I would not rule that out, Shekhar, because they have done that previously. We do know now that in 1962, and this is also based upon memoirs of some of the Chinese leaders which are surfacing in the last few years.
62 was the peak of the Great Leap Forward disaster.
Yes. It was actually the time when Mao was being blamed for the Great Leap Forward and needed distractions. And it is believed that certainly the attack on India was part of that distraction at a time when the Soviets and the Americans were locked in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So although there is no hard evidence to back the fact that what they did in April might have been for that, that could certainly be one of the reasons. What there is no doubt about is that this was a very deliberate action they took. This was not the action of a local commander or even of a local theater commander. It had to have sanction from the top. And in a sense, what they did broke the Vivendi, the modus vivendi, which had worked for 3 decades after 1988. And we have to deal with the new situation now.
And they did it deliberately. So they wanted to break the modus vivendi.
Yeah, I certainly believe that. I certainly believe it to be the case. Well, I wouldn't say they wanted to break the modus vivendi. I think they perhaps wanted to cause us problems, to damage us in some way, but it didn't quite work out that way. I think the Indian government's response after the initial period was swift. It was handled in a professional manner. And I think by the end of the year, we pretty much evened the score, as it were. Now, the saga is not yet over. I'm not in the know of what is happening, but I understand that discussions are on. So I guess we have to give it time. But I believe that we should not be in a hurry to conclude anything. A job that is well done is better than a job done in haste. So I think we need to allow the government a little more time to deal with the situation.
So you would say that as we stand, compared to, say, the same time last year, end of May last year, because that is when trouble was really building up, we have a draw on points so far in this round of whatever has happened?
I would certainly say that. I would think both on the military and diplomatic fronts, we have regained good ground. Yeah. And but as I said, it is work in progress. So this is still the initial period.
But Vijay, you've been watching this situation now for a very long time, the India-China situation. I know you've studied that border, the geography, the history better than most people, definitely more better than me. So there is one big argument right now. One lot says that now the Chinese are not sitting on any territory which we consider our own, besides what they took in 1962, right? The other is that no, but they've taken all this Depsang area, that they've taken area in Hot Springs, and they've taken area in some other places. What do you think is closer to the truth, or what is the truth?
Shekhar, I don't think anybody says that the Chinese are not sitting on our territory. I think all political parties have agreed that they are in occupation of 33,000 square kilometers of territory in Aksai Chin. And they are laying claim to Arunachal Pradesh. I think that some of these issues are legacy issues. You talk of Depsang, that is a legacy issue. For quite a number of years, both sides have been patrolling this area with no definitive control by either side. And perhaps neither side sought to impose control because of certain geographical and weather factors and so on. Now, that does not mean that there was no attempt by the Chinese side over the last 10 years to encroach in a sort of almost permanent way there. But I think that we've been able to stop that pretty effectively. Now, I'm not by any means saying that therefore in every single inch of every single place we've been able to do so, because this is an enormous territory, barren, extremely hostile, and there are no geographical features. In Ladakh, it's all flat land. But I think there is no truth to rumor that large chunks of land have been taken over in the last few years by the Chinese because, let me say this way, because the Indian army let down its guard. I don't believe that. And since I've dealt with this for a few years, not recently, but certainly till 2019, I don't think that view is factually correct.
Well, 2019 was recent enough. So specific question: have the Chinese taken 1,000+ square kilometers of territory in Depsang or not?
No, my answer is no.
No.
Unless those who claim this are able to produce evidence to the contrary. And that should be fairly easy to produce with all the Google Earth maps and satellite imagery. If in fact the Chinese have taken over the Depsang Bulge or permanent establishments have been set up, that should be fairly easy to prove. And then of course I might reverse my view. But to my understanding, this is not factually correct.
Yeah. So what has happened is that the areas to which we were patrolling, they are stopping us. The areas to which they were patrolling, India is stopping them.
Yes. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is that if the Chinese claim that we are nibbling away at their border, which is what the claim is, then I would think that the country which is being nibbled away will want the LAC to be clarified. Normally, somebody who is nibbling at it doesn't want it to be clarified. They want to eat more and more. Therefore, we have to ask the Chinese side, if indeed you feel India is nibbling away at your territory, at what they claim is their territory, why is it that they don't want the LAC to be clarified? And that question has an answer in it. The answer is the nibbling is the other way around. It is the Chinese who are nibbling away. It is we who say, let's stop this by clarifying the LAC. And the Chinese don't want that to happen because they want to keep on nibbling away. So I cannot find any other rational explanation for Chinese behavior.
So what do the Chinese want? I mean, is it purely local tactical that get a little more territory, get this height, this something? Or is there a strategic motive? Because a country that size, a power that much bigger than India, it's unlikely that the motive can be like 1962, let me get this better tactical position. I'm on this height, he's on that height.
So it's clearly not tactical, as you say. In 1962 also, it was strategic. Mao, now we know because some of the instructions of Mao Zedong are public. Essentially, Mao said that we need to teach India a lesson so that for the next 20 years, it will not try to challenge us and we will keep them in their place. That was the intention in 62. I don't know whether a similar intention was there in 2020 as well. But they, of course, need to also recognize the fact that the India of 2020 is not the India of 1962. And I'm not talking in military terms. I'm even talking in terms of public opinion. The Indian public opinion is no longer, let me say, scared of China, as we might have been in 1962 against an unknown force. Regrettably, what the Chinese have done is seriously damaged public opinion in India, and that will be much more difficult to overcome than any diplomatic or military understanding that we may reach. It is that which is China's challenge today, not finding a diplomatic or military solution to Eastern Ladakh.
Do you think the Chinese miscalculated or misunderstood public opinion in India, or they thought the strategic stakes were so high that they could be bothered?
Both. But I think the first part of your sentence is the more important part. Shekhar, my own sense, and I have also written about this in a recent paper, is that they have allowed scholarship on India to substantially degenerate because their focus was on the United States, the West, Russia, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. As a result, they continue to believe that India has all sorts of social, economic, religious, ethnic, and other problems, but don't recognize that, of course, you also have economic growth, you also have a better education, R&D, a stronger military, and so on. This is not the first time that they have misjudged. They did so during our nuclear tests in '98. They have done so subsequently as well because they have assumed that we are weak, but subsequently realized that we are not as weak as they think we are.
So do you think at some point they might review this, or they are stuck now?
No, I don't think they're stuck. I think the Chinese have a great capacity to do a volte-face because they talk in elliptical terms and they never actually deal with the problem outright. They always have some principle or some saying which allows them to make a U-turn.
Yeah.
But the question is, are they prepared to relook at the India of 2020 and deal with it? Because the fact is that while they are emerging as a major country, we are also emerging as a major country. Maybe at present not as fast as they are, but we are not in the reverse direction. A number of other countries are going in the reverse direction, a number of their other competitors, but we are going along with them upwards. Do they really want to make an adversary of a country with which they may have to live for the next 100 years? So I think they need to think that through.
So I'll take some questions from our subscribers, because normally we would have done this with an audience and fed them some nice wine and something to eat, but we can't do any of that. So they are there vicariously, and I have some questions. So
Sure.
there is Ameya Chubhale from Sakal Media, in fact, from your city, who asks, how seriously is Quad taken by China?
Oh, I think China takes Quad very seriously because it has decided that this is an institution or a mechanism or a platform which has anti-China written all over it. What they are trying to do, however, is that they are trying to confuse the concept of the Indo-Pacific with this mechanism. And there is no need to do that, because the Indo-Pacific is a vision which India has, many other countries have as well. ASEAN has it, the United States, Japan, Australia, they all have it. We all have different visions of the Indo-Pacific. It's a consultative process and it will come in. Quad is a mechanism. And for that matter, I mean, you know, the Chinese have a mechanism between Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China. That is also a Quad. And then they have one between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and China. That is also a Quad. So how is this Quad that we are in different from that Quad which they are in? I think sometimes countries have been a little too polite in calling out the Chinese, who practice one thing, preach one thing, and practice another. Maybe, I think now, however, countries are beginning to call them out, and they should be called out. they should also explain why they need to have counter coalitions of states. And shouldn't we consider that to be anti-Indian?
Yeah, because also even BRI is some kind of a counter coalition.
Yeah, in fact, Shekhar, it is not only a counter coalition, it is a unilateral initiative.
Yeah.
In contrast, the Indo-Pacific vision is not unilateral. It's not as if India or the Australia or the United States unilaterally decided this is a take it or leave it. We are all discussing it and we are adding elements to it from everybody else. The BRI, however, was a take it or leave it. It was unveiled in May 2017 in Beijing. I was there, I was the ambassador. Countries were told to come in and sign on a piece of paper they had not seen before. And the Chinese are not willing to discuss the larger issues and concerns around it. So that's absolutely unilateral.
I remember that picture of those heads of states lined up.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were in Beijing in 2017. So one more crisis that you dealt with then was Doklam. What happened there? Again, what were the Chinese trying to get? Did they get some of what they wanted?
Look, I think the Doklam issue is too recent, and I don't want to get into the details of it because I think that may not be proper at this time, particularly when the government is dealing with another crisis at the other end of the boundary. What I do want to say is that there was a very specific objective that the government of India had, and which was articulated in Parliament by our concerned ministers.
That is Jamperi Ridge.
No, which is the tri-junction. In other words, whenever the borders of three countries meet, it has to be trilaterally decided where that meeting point is. And China did not appear to be adhering to that understanding. It was as simple as that. Now, we might well argue as to why a trilateral is important because it's just a point on the ground. But then there is a geostrategic significance to territory, and it has to be looked at from that perspective. And therefore, the government of India was compelled to act. And I think that, again, that was a limited objective. And to my mind, we achieved the limited purpose we had set out to achieve.
So besides that, what the Chinese are doing in area underneath it, which they claim theirs, but Bhutan claims its own, that is not such a big strategic concern for us.
They were doing that. They were doing that even before 2017. It was not as if the first time they appeared was in June of 2017. Right from 2001, if I'm not mistaken, or even perhaps 1999, the comings and goings on were there. So it is not. It is a qualitatively new situation in the sense that now they have got some permanent presence, but effectively they already had control, because nobody else was going into that place. So, whether they were permanently stationed, semi-permanently there, or just coming and going, really did not make much of a difference.
So how do you see the Bhutanese now being able to handle it going ahead?
Oh, I think Bhutan is quite competent and capable. They understand China very well. And, they are very wise leaders. So I don't foresee a problem in Bhutan.
China is offering them a deal. China is saying, be nice to us on the western side and take what you want. And we will not take any of yours on the eastern side, on the middle side. So
that, I believe, is the offer that they've made. I don't think the royal government of Bhutan have accepted it yet. So I guess, I presume it's a matter of negotiation between them. I really can't say more because, these are two foreign governments. Because
the sanctuary that they want, for the Chinese to claim that, they are linking it to their claim on Arunachal.
Well, they are great at linking everything else to everything else when it suits them.
Right.
So that's a part of Chinese deception and strategy, which we all are used to.
I also get amused. I'm watching all this controversy over Lakshadweep. Now, whatever the social and religious issues, the fact is these are islands, every island in a wide ocean, particularly when it's just a scattered bunch of islands in a very wide ocean, has a big strategic aspect to it. The Chinese didn't have islands there. They would have dug up islands.
Yes, right.
They would have brought them from someplace. And we are fighting over what we have ourselves. So I keep saying that these are the Andaman system and the Lakshadweep system are the two sets of permanent, indestructible aircraft carriers.
Indeed, indeed. And the strategic value is increased because as our own exports and imports grow, the sea routes of communication become increasingly important. And I think for the last 10 years, therefore, maritime diplomacy has been one of the prime aspects of Indian diplomacy.
Yeah, and this is a time when the Americans are going and making friends with the Maldivians. So it tells you what's happening in that area. Anyway, I'll come back to our subscriber. Zeba Hassan wants to know, will India have any water sharing treaty with China in the context of the Brahmaputra River from hydro diplomacy point of view? And she's suggesting, won't it be a good idea if India, China, and Bangladesh work together?
On the problem with this is that this, apart from the very limited sharing of information relating to 2 or 3 rivers that China is providing us with, and that too for a limited period of time each year, they haven't really expanded that basket of information despite requests from the government of India. So we are rather far away, I would say, from talking of water sharing. When even the sharing of information, there is a reluctance even to share the minimal information which might impact upon the downstream flows of the river. The government of India, of course, persists in its efforts to get that information. It's important even from the planning perspective for India. But I'm not sure how optimistic we can be that the Chinese will give it. The Chinese are not terribly keen, I think, in getting into water sharing arrangements with anybody. And they are, of course, the source of rivers to Central Asia and to Southeast Asia and to South Asia.
Now, you've dealt with the Chinese in various capacities right through your career. How tough is it to deal with them? Is it frustrating? Is it enjoyable professionally? In terms of a challenge, or how often do you have a situation? Why do I have to deal with the Chinese?
Actually, Shekhar, we often used to discuss in the External Affairs Ministry, and if you talk to officers who deal with the Russians or with the Iranians and even with the Americans, they will tell you the Chinese are very easy to deal with. The Russians are much more difficult and the Iranians are impossible. So first of all, I don't think that people who have dealt with China can claim that, this is the most difficult country to deal with. But secondly, I think each country has a style of negotiation. If you get used to that and you understand the way in which that is done, then it becomes much easier to manage that negotiation. And I think to that extent, what I can say is that the External Affairs Ministry certainly has a core competence in this, because certainly with some of the major countries, I'm not saying with all of them, but certainly with countries like Russia, China, the United States, and so on, there are a group of officers who over their careers have dealt with it. And that being the case, they do have insights which the rest of us benefit from. So, for instance, when I was the Foreign Secretary and I didn't have an insight into how to deal with countries other than China because I'd never really dealt with them, there were officers we could rely on who had very good understanding. And I think that's the core. Regrettably, it is not used enough by other ministries of the government of India when it ought to be used, because negotiating with one country is not the same as negotiating with another. There's language, there's culture, there's phraseology, there's a whole host of other issues involved.
Yeah. So America, China, now everybody had thought that with Trump gone, things will change, but things have changed, but in the same direction. Looks like Biden has picked up the baton from Trump and started running even faster this lap. And also this Wuhan lab issue has opened up. Are you surprised that this Wuhan issue has opened up?
No, I'm not surprised, because there were such reports earlier. And at that stage, the world was dealing with the crisis, and therefore there was really no time to go into this. Merely because the issue has opened up doesn't mean that there is any truth to it. But it deserves a proper examination by a dispassionate body of people, because it has been the most destructive international event after the Second World War. And just as in the second, after the First and Second World Wars, there was a lot of introspection globally. I think this incident deserves introspection. It has to start from the origin or the supposed origin of the virus. But as far as American policy is concerned, Shekhar, I think that there are a number of factors. This includes the Chinese behavior. It includes American perceptions about what sort of returns they have got for the investments they made in China. It involves the perception of China's neighbors and peripheral countries. So I don't think it is simply either President Trump or President Biden switching positions. There is a long it's backed by a lot of other small inputs. And I think
and institutional energies.
Absolutely.
So you've interacted with China, you've lived in China more than once. What do the Chinese think of the Pakistanis? I know deeper than the sea is higher than the Mount Himalayas, that's okay. But culturally, etc., what do they think of the Pakistanis? Do they think of Pakistan as a wonderful, smart, powerful country which is showing India its place? Or they look at Pakistan as one little country that will collapse without their help? Do they treat Pakistan as a client state or as an equal psychologically?
I don't think China treats any other country as its equal, with the exception of the United States, not even Russia. But I don't think they treat it as purely a client state. They do feel that this is a strategic ally for them in South Asia. And as a strategic ally, they're prepared to pay a certain economic price, a fairly substantial one if it comes to that, to maintain this. That having been said, I don't see any cultural synergy between the Pakistanis and the Chinese. Most of China's cultural writings deal essentially with the India of in a historical context. That is, undivided India in a historical context, not in terms of Pakistan in its present cultural context.
You saw this recent article in Xinhua blaming the British for Kashmir problem, which somebody we are all fans of, Lijian Zhao, put out a tweet threat on, and for some reason, hours after I had read the tweet threat, I had the privilege of being blocked by him. So what is that article saying? Because nothing happens in the Chinese system without somebody wanting it to happen.
No, I think sometimes they do say things without necessarily thinking it through, and this was probably one of those things. Their position is fairly well known. They claim that this is a disputed territory, and they continue to play with words. So when it suits them, they say it should be bilaterally resolved. When it suits them, they say UN Security Council has a role. But I think that I don't think we should read too much more into what Li Qiantao says. He has a habit of putting his foot in his mouth.
This article in Xinhua said that if India was the crown, was a jewel in the British crown, then Kashmir is the crack in it. That's maybe a transliteration of something more profound in Chinese language. But
I can't understand what the saying is in English. I think I ought to check the Chinese text, but I haven't checked it. I think probably something is lost in translation here.
I think we have to check with Anant Krishnan, because I saw it.
Yes, he reported, yes.
To anybody who wants to understand China, I think should subscribe to his newsletter.
Indeed.
I'm happy to plug it, although it doesn't work for us, unfortunately. Then I have some more questions from subscribers. Tirthankar Banerjee of University of Cambridge, who says that India has good scientists, China has good labs, good resources. Why have India and China never collaborated or cooperated in scientific research?
At least during my time in China, it was not for want of trying, Shekhar. But I think the systems are very different, and the areas in which the Chinese want to collaborate are extremely fringe areas. And this is something which almost suggests as if it is something which is being done routinely rather than with any great desire to collaborate on serious innovation. and serious project. So I would not fault the Indian side on this matter. I think a number of our secretaries for science and technology or the heads of our scientific agencies have come to Beijing on a number of occasions and made an effort, but I don't think they've really succeeded.
So there's Anil Jain who wants to know that the Chinese are sort of going all over us with BRI now, with all the countries in our neighborhood. Will India be able to counter this or counterbalance this with the Quad, or Quad is a completely different thing?
Oh, I don't think that Quad and BRI have any sort of relevance to each other. I think the Quad is one of the mechanisms by which India is reorienting her foreign policy from a land-based foreign policy to a foreign policy in the maritime domain. And that is being necessitated by the fact that a lot of your trade, the overseas Indians who are in the Gulf and in Southeast Asia, your investment, etc., is now driven by your maritime domain. So I don't think that there is any relevance. As far as BRI is concerned, look, at the end of it all, by 2040 or 2050, if India's economy continues to go according to the projections that the World Bank and others have given, this is a desirable market for anybody. So I suspect that the original intention of BRI was, and the future intention will be, to somehow get to India. I don't think that building an extremely expensive railroad through Nepal or a road through difficult terrain in Pakistan is intended to supply 20 million Nepalis or, even 100 million Pakistanis. I think they're looking to get to the Indian market, and I think that's the objective.
Yeah, no more than that. Siddharth Parakala, who says there is a lot of talk of China's way of handling Hong Kong, Uyghurs, Jack Ma, etc., etc., etc. Why is there not much resentment or rebellion from within the Chinese population? Is CCP what Chinese desire as well as deserve, or is it just a matter of time?
So I sort of answered that question a little earlier, essentially by saying that
it's also in a way.
Yes, the last chapter actually deals with this. But in a short sentence, Shekhar, I feel that at the moment, the large majority of the population is getting the goods they want. Their material comforts have been taken care of or are being taken care of. And therefore, there is no imminent reason to rebel against the state. Let me put it that way. That is not to say that there is no difference of view within the country. As I said, we have to be on the lookout for when the cracks occur, because it is not a monolith.
Yeah. So I know that you have other stuff to do, including teaching, which is very important. You are teaching at Symbiosis Institute, yes. I know. And I think it's a wonderful thing that students are now learning from domain specialists. Instead of watching sort of funny movies about China and making stereotype ideas. So I'll just take the last couple of questions. Nidhi Sangvi from Credit Suisse wants to know, how will the selection of the next Dalai Lama pan out? And what are the implications for India-China relationship?
Well, that has quite serious implications, because the current 14th Dalai Lama has been recognized by the Chinese as the official Dalai Lama. And therefore, although they consider him to be a separatist, but they don't doubt that he represents the institution. There is equally no doubt that they will install their own 15th Dalai Lama when the 14th Dalai Lama moves on. So the question that arises then is, if another incarnation is found, where will it be found? And how will that impact on India? Now, that depends on a number of circumstances. Will that incarnation be found in India? Will it be found at all? Will it be found in India? If not, what is India's relationship to that? And so on and so forth. So it's rather speculative at this stage. I think the only thing we can say with certainty is that the Chinese will install their own 15th Dalai Lama. But we have seen in the case of the Panchen Lama that the 11th Panchen Lama installed by them in I think the early 1990s, almost 20 years ago, 25 years ago, has still not been accepted by a substantial part of the Tibetan population, who support the Dalai Lama appointed Panchen Lama, who is somewhere in house arrest somewhere in China.
Yeah, and it's the Panchen Lama who has to identify and certify the reincarnate, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a group of people, but Panchen Lama is one of the critical points in each other's appointments. Yes, that's right.
So that is something that you see coming up in the course of time.
Yes, of course.
Maybe sooner than we think. So Nanima Basu, who you know well, I'm keeping my colleagues' questions to the end, and that's only two questions. One, Nanima, because she's Nanima, and second, because she's among our youngest colleagues. So Nanima wants to talk about the two summits that you facilitated, 2018 and 19. Were these wasted efforts?
Yeah, Shekhar, that's a good question. I think it deserves a proper answer. My own understanding is that the current Prime Minister has had more or less continued the same policy of engagement as his predecessors. Yes, there was some change in style. There was a certain new realism that he brought in terms of articulating India's concerns. It is also true that the Prime Minister felt that reciprocity is important. After all, this is a relationship between two equal powers. China talks of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But in substantive terms, the policy of engagement continued, and the two summits were a solid proof of that commitment of the Prime Minister to engagement. Now, of course, engagement does not mean, and very rarely at the summit level means, an immediate solution to problems. That is not how the world works, and it is certainly not the way the Chinese work. So my understanding was that these two summits were part of the engagement process for the two leaders to exchange views on a variety of subjects, because we are, after all, two of the major emerging countries in the world. The short answer is, at least in my personal opinion, the summits served a purpose. It was not intended to produce a sort of path-breaking result, because that, in any case, the two governments had made it clear before the summits were held. And I don't think that it is a wasted effort. Now, of course, moving ahead, whether more summits will be held or not is something which people currently in government have to answer. I can't answer to that.
So how would you respond to the idea? It's an argument that 2014 on, India misread the Chinese, in the sense that India thought that India now has a strong, powerful leader. China has a strong, powerful leader. They can deal with each other. So was there, and misunderstanding extends to not appreciating even the limitations of a Xi Jinping in the Chinese system, that he can't pick up the phone and get things done for you.
Oh, that the Chinese are simply not used to telephone and other diplomacy. But no, to answer your question, Shekhar, I don't think that was the case. I think the Indian side has a fairly good understanding of how China works and how China operates. The fact of the matter is that the Indian side has also always placed China in an important position in our diplomacy. I suspect the Chinese side needs to rethink where India stands in the Chinese diplomacy. Because if China believes that we are just a small peripheral country, then I think the misreading is on the Chinese side. It's not on our side. We've always considered China to be a major country, a major power, an important neighbor, a big player in international affairs, and we've never obstructed this process in any way. The Chinese, on the other hand, regrettably, whether it is in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, whether it is in the 1267 Sanctions Committee, have engaged in, I would call, relatively petty action. To allow one terrorist to be listed in the 1267 committee would not in any case change China's image, nor would it in any case give India great leverage. But by blocking it, it impacts on 1.4 billion Indians, not just on the few people in the government of India. And I think the Chinese probably just don't understand that. Well, they have a different political system.
Yeah. So final question from Priya Krishnan Kutty, who also writes about foreign affairs, but she's probably my youngest colleague. And she says it's become commonplace for variants to be named after the country where they were discovered. UK variant, South African variant, Indian variant. So does this hurt bilateral relations in any way? And why do some countries get sensitive, including us in India? And why is everybody afraid of calling the virus that came from China, the Chinese virus, except Trump.
No, I don't think it's an issue of sensitivity, Shekhar, but either we name everything according to the place it comes from or nothing. You can't have China saying we will not call it Wuhan virus simply because they're the second most powerful country in the world, and then find it perfectly acceptable to call it a South African variant or an Indian variant because we don't carry the same clout.
Right.
That's unfair. So I think the government of India's position, and I suspect that of South Africa and Brazil, are precisely that. If we want to start by calling it the Chinese virus, then we don't have a leg to stand on. But if the rest of the world says you don't call it one, then why should they call it an Indian variant? I fully disagree with that approach.
And soon you will have the United Nations of coronavirus.
Yes, sir. Very
Vijay, thank you very much. We can go on talking, and soon enough, I know times will change, so we'll meet physically and talk.
Yes, I look forward.
Pune is also one of my favorite cities, but I can conclude this on a note of warning. And the warning is, you just described China as the second most powerful country in the world. You might have some trouble coming from the Chinese side. Maybe Lizian Zhao will block you now from watching his Twitter handle.
That's possible. That's possible.
One good thing at least I feel about us Indians is we can still laugh at ourselves. I don't know if the Chinese can do it. Can the Chinese laugh at themselves?
No, I don't think so. They can't take any criticism. They are very thin-skinned. And compared to that, we are very, very much more thick-skinned. And that stands to our advantage in negotiations as well.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Vijay.
Thank you.
Stay fit and keep writing. I think one of the most marvelous things that's happened lately is that you've come with a very special specialization, China. China is so important for the world, and now you're producing so much scholarship. I hope it also inspires many others to do it.
Thank you. Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know a lot of people will watch it, and also our subscribers who are watching. It's not a thick book. It's a very quick, it's written like a thriller. Please read it. And it didn't happen yesterday. A lot of you were not even born when this happened, 1989. And when you read this, then you will also need to reflect on many things, that how come in 1989, these student leaders and others stood up, and today, Hong Kong, which has been free for so long, this level of protest has not taken place, and also how quickly the world has turned away from Hong Kong. So these are also things that tell you about China's powers, and that's the reason we must keep talking about China, and that's why we need teachers like Vijay Gokhale. Vijay, thank you.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet,